Hi, Misha here, and let's mix things up a bit and talk about tanks, specifically Russian tanks. And yes, we will get to the T-34, but we need to kind of begin at the beginning with the T-26. And we have examples in 1/72 scale diecast of a couple of the major variants. Here we have the early model 1931, and here we have the later 1933, 1938 pattern or style, with obviously the biggest difference being in the turret and the armament. So yeah, we'll dive into this of the first, I guess you should say, modern interwar Soviet tanks. Before we begin, quite obviously, I cannot drive. I never have been able to drive. I do not know much about automobiles. So, with that out of the way, let's talk history. The T-26 is really a licensed production variant of the British Vickers 6-ton tank, specifically the Model A. Russia really didn't have much in the way of tanks going on. Its main tank after World War I was the T-18, quite an obsolescent design. And Vickers designed the 6-ton tank beginning around 1928 as a simple, dependable, rugged tank for less developed nations. And in 1930, a Soviet delegation went to England to purchase, equipment and manufacturing rights for many things, including farm implements, tanks, what have you. And they quickly latched on to the Vickers 6-ton. It just seemed well suited to Russian needs. So in May, a contract was signed. Russia would purchase 15 tanks built in the UK, with Soviets watching Vickers, how they built them, and production documentation and licensing rights were transferred to them. Now, this was not an exact copy of the Model A, although the tanks that were actually built in the UK, of course, would be. They were known as the V-26. We only had the 15 pattern tanks, and those were delivered between late 1930 and early 1932. In Russia, production was set up at factory number 174. An initial pre-production batch of tanks was produced in June, with full production opening up in August. And there were a lot of production issues early on with poor quality armor, welding, riveting, metallurgy, engines, about everything. But they would quickly learn. In this early version here, with the two turrets, it's quite interesting. There are two basic weapons configurations. This one here has two DT 7.62 machine guns, one on each turret. And they do rotate, meaning both guns could point forward or in the back, but only one gun could point to the side. And early on, armor was anywhere from 6 millimeters up to 10 and even 13 in certain areas. But again, the quality was kind of iffy. It was a gas-powered engine, 4-cylinder. And the overall length was about 15 feet and 8 feet side to side. Even though it was based on a 6-ton tank, in effect, it was over 9.5 tons by the time the Soviets got done with it. And speed, well, it got up to about 19 miles per hour on road and under 15 on a rougher, gravel or mud or dirt roads, and actually just under 10 miles per hour cross country. But it was one of the better interwar tanks, and in fact, the most mass-produced interwar tank. And this effectively made the Soviet Army the largest mechanized army on paper in the 1930s. But the dual turret design of the 1931, it was great for infantry support, but its potential, especially with the 2 machine guns, by the way, the other version would have 1 machine gun and 1 low-velocity 37mm gun. Yeah, there wasn't a lot of potential there. So, in 1933, the new version was introduced. The body was the same, but now we have a new cylindrical turret. And we have a high-velocity 45mm cannon. And this would have anywhere from 1 to 4 DT 7.62mm machine guns, depending on the version and variant and how it was armed up. Also, the armor was increased over time up to 15mm in certain areas. The fuel tank was enlarged and it was given the ability to have an auxiliary fuel tank as well. And other improvements were made. Now, with the 1933 variant, a radio was not standard at this time, only on command tanks, so just once in a while. And there would be other later versions. For example, towards the end of production, there would be the Model 1938, which introduced a new conical turret. And then the final version of note was the Model 1939, which had improved armor protection, but this was already at the end of production. But really, throughout most of the 30s, it kind of just was the Russian main tank, along with the BT tank, which was actually based on an American design, the Christie. And they would produce a bunch of these. The second factory would open up in 1933 at the Stalin Tractor Factory. And they really were getting better at manufacturing by 1934, 1935. And several small improvements were introduced. The first major combat would come in October of 1936, when the first of nearly 300 T-26s were delivered to Spain, where they were used in the Civil War, of course against other German armor at the time. And Russia would first use theirs in large-scale combat during a border dispute with Japan, with the first major battle coming that summer during Lake Kazan. And this would continue into 1939 with fighting in Mongolia and elsewhere. Now, by 1939, this is already starting to be quite an aged design, but it's still in production and isn't quite been totally obsolete yet. So it was used during the invasion of Poland in September, and then in November, December, January, through the invasion of Finland during what we know as the Winter War. And it was here that it really started to show its age. Even with the improved armor, finish, 37mm anti-tank guns, and even 20mm Lottie anti-tank guns were able to punch through the T-26. Although, to be fair, the combat in a lot of places in Finland was pretty short-ranged. But also, it had relatively light armament by the standards of the 1930s and into the 40s. Initially, the .45 caliber gun would have 122 rounds. Later versions of the tank with more stowage would up that to 147 rounds. And nearly 3,000 rounds of 7.62 by 54R ammunition were available for the machine guns. By the way, this had a crew of 3. And you had the commander, gunner, and driver. And in the 2-turret version like this, the commander did double duty as another gunner. So kind of a heavy workload on the commander. But nevertheless, they produced a ton of these. Manufacturing was finally halted in February of 1941, so just on the eve of World War II, or the Great Patriotic War. And they had built over 10,300 of these, with the Model 1933 being overall the most common variant. Although they would produce over 2,000 of the dual turret versions as well, so not a small number. And even the later versions, they would produce over 4,000 38s and 39s collectively. So that's the thing that Russia could do well. Mass production. Quality might not always be great, but they could sure make a bunch of them, even if they maybe weren't the best in the world. And it really wasn't a bad tank for the 1930s. And more importantly for Russia, it was a learning experience. It was a pretty forgiving design for them really to get their manufacturing in order. Which, would lead to the T-34 and other designs. It's actually thanks to the experiences of the T-26 that the T-34 was able to go into production the way it did and as effective as it was. Even though it was out of production in June of 1941, this is still the most numerous tank in the Red Army, and the Germans came up against a lot of these. And keep in mind, the early Panzers weren't exactly amazing themselves, so they didn't do great, but Russia had so many of them, and they were fighting on home turf, that there were some notable victories in 1941 and into 42. But after that, after they had enough T-34s and later designs like the KV-1, these were pretty much pulled out of frontline service. A lot of the older 2-turret versions had already been either upgraded or retired or turned into flamethrower tanks. And the later 33 versions, they would have upgraded a few of them in 1940 and 41 to a more modern standard, but in relatively small numbers. So by the time of the Battle of Kursk, this was out of frontline duty. However, it would actually have its last combat all the way in 1945, yet again against the Japanese in Manchuria. This would be right before the end and right before Japanese surrender, because these had been transferred to the Far East, not exactly the hotbed front because of, Germany in the West. But after the Germans were dealt with, the Russians started going at the Japanese to try to get a piece of the Pacific pie. And there were still a number of T-26s in that region. Thus, they saw combat. But by this point, spare parts and what have you were starting to become in short supply, and a 45mm cannon was pretty small potatoes by the standards of the late World War II period. So it's an often overlooked tank, and maybe at first not that remarkable, but it was Russia's first modern tank, the most mass-produced tank in the world in the interwar period, and a perfectly good light infantry tank for what it was meant to do. Primitive, of course, with pretty crude construction, early on. I mean, Soviet design never really got away from that to some extent, but it would lead to greater things. So I had to mention it, and it definitely did see a lot of combat use in the first year of World War II, the Great Patriotic War, even if it was kind of cannon fodder, literally. So this is where I thought it would be a good place to begin. Again, so I don't really know a lot about cars and car engines. I'm in it for the history. I do know guns, some. And I know aircraft, well, more than I know tanks. But it is a part of history, and I think these are neat. These are 172 scale, like I said. The brand names change. The tooling almost always is the same. Sometimes they're branded under Eagle Moss, sometimes De Agostini, sometimes Atlas, sometimes Model Collect. It seems like it's just the same tooling under different names. That's pretty common for the less expensive models. And these are, at least, if nothing else, inexpensive. Anywhere from $10 to $20. And they do usually have rotating turrets, sometimes even elevating guns, and moving tracks. If not moving, at least usually rubber. So this is where we begin. Let me know what you think, and feel free to drop a suggestion for a piece of armor you'd like to hear talked about, and we'll do it in a future video. This is Misha. Appreciate you tuning in, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.